When I talk to Christians about the Old Testament, I found it remarkable that many of them still think that God acted as a perfect, omnipotent being should. It literally boggles my mind that someone can see genocide and murder in cold blood as righteousness. But still, Christians insist upon defending the terrible acts of violence in the Old Testament. They still identify God's actions as good. So, I stopped and really thought about it. How would I expect a truly perfect, ever-present, all-powerful, all-good, all-just, and all-merciful God to act? What sort of actions would I expect to see? How can I be sure that these actions were those of a godlike being? Would the distinction between human-inspired actions and God-inspired actions be obvious or subtle? Ultimately, I wondered, what did the footsteps of a perfect God look like? And how would they compare to the stories in the Old Testament? As I pondered these questions and others, I began to develop a profile of what I should prepare to look for when searching through the Old Testament for a perfect God. First, I reasoned that the perfect being must be all-knowledgeable and ever-present, and therefore never make mistakes due to lack of knowledge. It should also never remember anything, forget anything, regret anything, or be oblivious of any action. I could expect to see choices whose results were inexplicably wise, and whose full grandeur had yet to be realized. I should also see no faults of any kind in perception, understanding, decision-making, or planning. Next, I reasoned that the God figure must be all-good and all-powerful, with the ability to do anything. With this in mind, I began to explore the possible realities I could expect to exist. To be sure, I should never see lapses in the God's kindness, or in the God's ability to help people. With the ability to benefit every living person on the planet with less than a whim, I would expect to see an instant and drastic rise in quality of life and life expectancy. I should also see dramatic changes in every field of science, resulting in radical miracle medicines, the elimination of many human diseases, and a substantially better understanding of the world and universe. Among these advances, I could expect to see a government spring up that is at least as effective as democracy, which succeeds in bringing peace to its citizens. I would also see human rights at a human history all-time high, and widespread peace due to a mutual respect for humanity as a whole. In short, I should imagine little less than a virtual utopia. Lastly, this God must be all-merciful and all-just. Dealing with a being who invented the very aspect of fairness, I felt instantly compelled to rule out all forms of capital punishment. I felt that I should see no lapses in moral judgment, and that this God should possess and display universal righteousness. In addition, I knew to expect a being who hated torture, who always acted in a justified and moral way, who always chose kindness before cruelty, and whose actions could be considered the greatest, most obvious moral standard to ever aspire to. I also knew that any punishment from this God must be fully appropriate, fitting the crime seamlessly. For the same reason, I should never see unjust judgments being made by his followers, or harsh, unwarranted punishments being dealt under his careful watch. This God figure must be a sentinel of justice and a beacon of mercy throughout his land. With this profile in mind, it is very important to identify the distinctions between human-inspired actions and God-inspired actions. After reviewing the profile, the obvious way to identify the origin source of any conduct is to identify its nature. If the result of an action is anything less than perfect, it is clearly the result of humanity. However, if the results of an action are flawless, obviously wise, just, merciful, and perfect in any context, this is a sign of interference from a perfect God. After all, are not all the actions and decisions of a perfect God perfect as well? Was not the will of this perfect God being played out on earth according to his perfection? In light of these conclusions, I at last began to apply my profile of perfect God to the Old Testament. What I found in the Old Testament was indescribably different from what I expected. Where I expected to find a kind and merciful Father of all life, I found a vengeful, mass-murdering monster whose callous actions could never be the work of a perfect God. Where I sought a just and wise leader, I found only the human weakness of rage, jealousy, failure, and discrimination. In all honesty, this realization was disheartening. I had hoped to find that which would offer me eternal life for goodness. Instead, I found pitiful, 2,000-year-old images of a bloodthirsty war god who represented what a true God would surely destroy.